everyone. Organising myself. Okay, first of all, let me say that it was actually the DV Clearinghouse who did the lion's share of organising today, so really I'd like to thank them for all their efforts. I know how hard it is to organise a forum in a state other than your own. It is a lot of legwork, so I've kind of swaned in at the last minute and quite relaxed, so thank you very much. I suppose today what I'd like to focus on is something a little bit different from what we've been talking about so far. I'm focusing on victim-centred crisis care, and I really want to sort of unpack that phrase specifically from a sexual assault perspective. For two reasons. One is that it does represent collaboration, particularly in Victoria, where you have been doing a lot of collaborative and interagency crisis care responses, similar to New South Wales, and certainly both New South Wales and Queensland have recently done some major reviews through KPMG about what hubs look like. But the second reason, I guess, to focus on this is that it reflects some of what Deb Weston was talking about before the lunch break, around what are some of the, I guess, just what has been the evolution of the DV sector, DV and family violence sector and the sexual assault sector since the 70s. And I think what you see when you look at victim-centred or crisis care responses to sexual assault, you see some of what some of those differences are and how they play out. So it's a kind of a narrow focus, so just bear with me. And what I've done is kind of look at a lot of the literature around victim-centred crisis responses, both here and particularly in the UK, and then I've tried to pull back to ask some questions around what that means. I also have a manuscript which is highly rare for me. I usually talk off the cuff and on the fly, but I'm actually prepared, so I will actually sort of refer to this now and again. So excuse me while I do that. I suppose when a victim survivor walks into a service or presents at a service following a sexual assault, in the immediate aftermath of a sexual assault, the acute impacts on the victim survivor and the response of service providers sets the scene for a really complex interplay of actions regarding victim survivor needs, therapeutic intervention, fact-finding and assessment, criminal prosecution, and victim survivor support and advocacy. These actions don't all take place within one arena, even though they might be co-located. The action occurs in one's physical space, but in terms of domains, it occurs across several different arenas and may involve health, medical and forensic services, specialist sexual assault services such as CASAs, law enforcement, and the circumstances may also require the involvement of statutory agencies, schools, family members, residential care authorities, housing services, mental health professionals or domestic violence services. So there are multiple actions as well as multiple domains that these actions occur in. To add to this, the organisational philosophies guiding the actions taken and decisions made are also multiple. Sexual assault counsellor advocates offer safety and support for victim survivors. Law enforcement gathers evidence to support the sexual offence charge. Medical practitioners offer medical services such as the treatment of injuries, testing for STIs and emergency contraception, and forensic specialists collect and analyse physical evidence from the victim survivor to corroborate their account. These various actions have different timetables and different objectives, even though they are all occurring within a crisis intervention situation. For instance, the goals of therapeutic intervention directly following an assault are to minimise trauma responses and return control over self and environment to the victim survivor. Yet the fact-finding and recording imperative of the legal process demands that a victim survivor tell their story almost at the outset and submit to the requirements of legal procedure. Within this, there is, of course, the victim survivor. Her main aim is to find mechanisms for coping existentially with the immediate aftermath of sexual victimisation and, in the longer term, to heal from that experience. So looking at the recent literature across psychology, community psychology, criminology, public health and health, as well as a lot of the grey literature that exists out there, i.e. Policies, procedures, guidelines. We can see that there is a wealth of knowledge about different aspects and successes of crisis responses following sexual assault. That's my little clicker. I pointed at that. What I pointed at?
Don't need to.
Oh, wow, it's magic. Yes, I do need to point it at something.
Switched on.
Okay. Someone's letting me in charge of an organisation. So this slide represents the growing number and emphasis on integrated sexual assault responses, both here in Australia, but and also in the UK, well, England and Wales. We currently, at last count, which would have been around about last year, have 30 sexual assault referral centres established across the country. The United States has their SART teams, which comprises those following services and responses. Malaysia has a one-stop crisis centre. Victoria has the multidisciplinary centres. The ACT recently have developed and implemented their wraparound services through Canberra Rape Crisis. And as I said, Queensland and New South Wales have both commissioned extensive reviews of what hub responses might look like for victim survivors. What emerges consistently is that what are variously called collaborative, co-located or interagency responses are seen as offering the best crisis response for victim survivors of sexual assault who want to access support following an incident. Integrated responses where police, sexual assault services and health services work together really have the capacity to be focused on victim survivor needs by minimising the need to access multiple services by going and having to explain the story again, fragmentation of services or a silo response. For workers in those integrated responses, what the research evidence suggests is that there's an increasing capacity of all workers and understanding of different workers, i.e. sexual assault workers, understanding the role of police, and police understanding the role of sexual assault workers, and that increasing understanding about what their roles are, which have, at least within the UK context, is translating to an expanded concept of victim survivor needs at crisis point and who victims are, because there's a sort of mutual education process going on. What I'm interested in today is thinking through the concept and goal of victim-centred crisis care and what this might mean, as I said, in a crisis setting, that is where there is an imperative to respond. There isn't time to not respond or to necessarily think through things. There is a necessity of quick decisions. What does victim-centred care mean in different contexts and organisations, and how might that play out within an operational context? And I guess the background to thinking through this was a research inquiry that AXA received about 2 years ago from one of our stakeholders, and that's something that we do, we provide research support. And the question was, what's important about sort of the first 3 days in responding to sexual assault victims? And so I went away and did some reading and sort of had a bit of a difficulty at trying to wrap my head around what crisis really meant for victim survivors of sexual assault and why there was this kind of possibly arbitrary stop at 3 days or 4 days. Why have we stopped there? So I just wanted to sort of trace back and try to understand what's going on there. The other thing that the question was interested in was victim-centred. What does it actually mean? As I said, there's a lot of policy and guidelines and protocol around it. There's the next question of what does that mean in practice? What does that mean as it's being operationalised by those different players in those different arenas? So what I'm going to sort of focus on is initially detentions, the tensions in the first instance, then to talk a little bit about some of the challenges, and then to sort of end on a high note with sort of a reflection on some of the possibilities that we're seeing in some of the literature and some of the ideas that have been spoken about. And I should say that what I'm hoping that this particular presentation does is encourage you guys to tell researchers, i.e. people like me, around, well, what is working, what isn't working, what does it mean to operationalise things in those contexts. I think one of the comments that was made earlier is that we're simply not documenting these endeavours. We're not actually writing down the learnings and the enriched ideas that are just constantly going backwards and forwards between police, between health, between sexual assault services, between domestic and family violence services. So, these are the sorts of things I wanted to focus on. Victim-centred, what are some of the definitions there? The concept of crisis versus the issues around agency and empowerment, and also crisis versus what we could call historical incidents, and some of the challenges. Okay, so in my sort of review endeavours, what I came across was a slight differentiation in, or emphasis I suppose is the best way to describe it, in terms of how victim-centred or client-centred is defined. This is from NSASIV guidelines of 1998, where there's, and this is from the Rape Crisis Network in Europe, and you can see that with both of them, there's a real emphasis on rights and empowerment, and on allowing victim survivors to set the pace, and that the role of the service is to be beside the victim survivor in setting the pace. And for the Rape Crisis Network, they talk about shared guidelines. They talk about privileging victim survivors' knowledge about their needs and building a service response that responds to those needs, and that the client and the service are regarded as equal partners in service provision. When we look at the Victorian Police Code of Conduct, we see a slightly different emphasis. And that emphasis is firstly on safety. From a policing perspective, being victim-centred involves supporting the victim, providing physical protection to ensure safety and engaging them in a non-judgmental manner. Yet, there is a question, I suppose, about how is a non-judgmental manner balanced in practice against the necessity of assessing the robustness of an allegation. So when we, a lot of the literature talks about the importance of validating victim survivors and their stories and their experiences when they're being told, yet there is a role of our law enforcement agency to gather the facts. And I guess that's complicated. So I guess what I'm sort of suggesting is that belief, the idea of validation and belief, is constrained by the nature of the policing role. And in a sense, police have to reserve judgment, at least initially, until it's demonstrated that a criminal event may have occurred. I think this is complicated by the fact that we have a fairly extensive evidence base around the stereotypes and myths about rape that might influence that suspension of belief. From a health perspective, symptoms of mental distress and physical harm can lead to quite directive care. Victim-centred may involve, or victim-centred approaches may involve making recommendations about what a victim survivor should do. A general practitioner may be a victim survivor's first point of contact following a sexual assault, and particularly in rural settings. The doctor may consider it part of the treatment to take initial swabs or not treat certain injuries in order to preserve forensic evidence. And similarly, there may be disagreement about victim-centred forensic medical care. And in a country like as big as Australia, that becomes quite an issue to think through. So there is some discussion within the forensic literature that best practice and victim-centred is state-of-the-art, highly resourced forensic hubs where you really centralise expertise and where the risk of, say, DNA contamination, etc. is minimised. Yet, do you really want to be waiting hours to get from Mildura to there, if you can even get there? So there's a tension there about what victim-centred actually means within these different organisational settings. A second area of tension relates to the notion of crisis. Is a crisis state something that happens only in the immediate aftermath of sexual assault? That is, does it have to be temporally proximate to the incident? And I guess this is where I was having real, conceptual difficulty with some of the questions that I was being asked to research on. On what basis is this assumption based? Are crisis and trauma models of for service responses different things? If so, how do they influence assumptions about victim survivor needs? So my question is really, is crisis a medico-legal construct, or is that or another way of saying that is that the construct we're actually working with at the moment for the sexual assault sector? An acute or crisis systems response that we currently have, for instance with the NDCs or the sexual assault referral centres in the UK, is ordinarily limited to recent sexual assaults, particularly in the criminal justice and healthcare domains. The time frame for recent is usually defined as 72 hours, or with sexual assault centres or specialist centres, it can be up to 2 weeks. Someone correct me if I'm wrong during question time, or subtly take me aside. Might be nicer. There are possibly two reasons for this focus on sort of immediate aftermath. That early supportive intervention at this maximum point of distress or disequilibrium can reduce the likelihood of post-traumatic stress disorder. And that from, or the other reason is that from a medical and forensic point of view, this is the best window available to attend to the health-related impacts such as unwanted pregnancy and to gather forensic evidence. Having investigated this issue, particularly those first 3 days in a little bit more detail, the forensic evidence is actually, or the forensic literature, is a little bit, not unclear, but actually says it depends. Those 72 hours were originally selected purely because it's when the morning after pill is is most effective. There isn't actually a forensic reason. Different types of bodily swabs, etc., have different lifetimes. So a bruise could in fact take a week to appear versus DNA swabs that really need to be removed, from the mouth or from the body fairly quickly. And what a number of forensic practitioners say who specialise in sexual assault is that their role is to corroborate, provide forensic evidence for the victim survivor's account. So they don't necessarily do kits, they actually do a forensic examination on the basis of the victim survivor's account. And I guess what I would suggest is that it's the second of these, and particularly the collection of forensic evidence, that looms large in understandings about crisis responses and developing best practice. There is a sense, particularly in some of the UK literature and commentary, that the sexual assault referral centres there are designed to improve the collection of forensic evidence gathering, the process for victim survivors, the quality of the samples and the legal worth, so the probative value for the criminal justice setting, not necessarily the sort of existential nature of crisis for the victim survivor. They may not be incompatible, but they probably shouldn't be regarded as being the same thing. Just to flag that we've got an issues paper coming out probably in about 6 months' time that Deb Parkinson, myself and Becca Philippborn co-wrote some time ago on forensic evidence, so we can have questions, and by all means direct some to Deb, around who actually accesses forensic services, in what time period, etc. I won't go into that now. Except to say that this slide here just points simply to the fact that those who are accessing formal supports, including crisis services and including health, may not necessarily represent, as we've heard with both Deb and Julie's presentation today and Deb and Jill's presentation today, the length of time that it takes to actually disclose sexual assault in particular settings like intimate partner violence. So, in short, a medico-legal framing of crisis can affect how victim survivors interpret their own experience, and the anticipation of rejection is powerful. Victim survivors, self-blame and shame have roles to play here. And there's some in-depth US research on victim survivors and their experiences of accessing crisis services, particularly emergency departments, but also the specialised crisis response centres, who talked about feelings of blame, even partially for their victimisation, and that the system would as well. Those who experienced non-stereotypical rapes also anticipated, i.e. the not stranger jumping out of the bush form of sexual assault, anticipated rejection because they didn't believe that they actually qualified for help. Like the broader community, survivors also held beliefs that rape was physically brutal and resulting in severe psychological and physical injuries. And so they're talking about being really messed up or extremely injured, severely injured, to be accessing a crisis response service. They thought that their lack of what they thought was their lack of psychological distress precluded them from needing formal support. And one woman says here that it seemed that you have to be totally devastated, and I don't think it affected me that bad. I tried not to let it affect me. So they recognised the physical and psychological impact of sexual assault, but they weren't necessarily enough to qualify for formal support. And to me, the concept of crisis, framed as a medico-legal construct where we are emphasising injury, seems to be dovetailing with this. What I'd be interested in hearing about during one of the discussion times is what is crisis within a DV setting, and to what extent does the relative absence of a forensic imperative change that? So this woman here says, I'm not really quite in crisis because I'm not bawling, it just didn't happen to me, but mentally and emotionally I'm a wreck. So, I just want to make sure I'm not going to babble on too much. Okay. So I guess my question is not so much that forensic evidence should not be collected or have a role in the prosecution of sexual assault, but it does beg the question of whether a predominantly medico-legal framing of crisis, acute or recent, is the best framing or construct for victim survivors. To what extent does it reinforce the atypical rather than the typical for victim survivors? So that is to say, whose crisis is it actually attending to? So, I guess one of the second things then to think about is whether crisis refers to the immediate aftermath of a sexual assault. Rape crisis workers and advocates here internationally worked exceptionally hard during the 1970s and 80s to dispel the idea that the first thing a genuinely sexually assaulted woman would do is raise a hue and cry and rush to the police or hospital. They pointed out that the acute impacts of sexual assault or reactions to sexual assault, such as shock, disbelief, the desire to get clean, to self-care, to just get on with it, tended to act as barriers to immediate support seeking. Burgess and Holstrom in 1974 reflected on what they called a rape trauma syndrome, in which the kernel of anxiety was, quote, a subjective state of terror and overwhelming fear of being killed, and that sort of resulted in a sort of a paralysis or a sort of survival mode, if you like. You don't go and talk to people when you're in survival mode. You sort of hunker down and find out whether any bits of you are seriously broken, in a literal or metaphorical sense. And this reflects the sort of broader crisis intervention literature, so crisis intervention, whether it's disasters or otherwise, which describes a process of mounting tension and maximum disorganisation following an experience of sexual assault, or following a sort of adverse experience. So the point here is that technically a crisis is not so much the immediate aftermath of an event as it is the disorganised reaction to that event. Where it happens along the way is not an inherent element of the definition, or at least how the literature is talking about it. So the literature talks about several stages of crisis: mounting tension, a plateau of disorganisation, the mobilisation of all internal and external resources, and either adaptation or maladaptation. For instance, drug and alcohol use as a way of kind of self-soothing. So I guess what this suggests to me is, again, another kind of tension about how we're setting up well, not so much setting up some of the systems, but we're stepping back with the guidelines and literature and ideas around victim-centred care. We've got, on the one hand, sexual assault services talking about empowerment, which is important in terms of allowing them to move at their own pace, but you have a legal imperative, a criminal justice imperative to move at a quicker pace. How do you balance those out? And particularly where, if you are talking about a crisis response and you are talking about disorganisation, the question I have is whether victim survivors are in the right headspace, in some ways, to be making lasting decisions. And in some jurisdictions, for instance, we don't have a just-in-case option in Victoria for forensics. You have to be pretty sure that you're going to go ahead and report to the police. That, to me, at that crisis point, is a huge burden on victim survivors to say, yeah, I can see that far into the future, and I'm prepared to do that. Other states and territories have separated out those two decisions so that you can have your forensic examination and it's stored for some time. You can come back to it in 3 months and say, yes, actually, I think I'm ready to go ahead. But where there isn't that option, it's conflating two big issues within the one decision-making process and not an ideal time for victim survivors. Okay. So that's issue ahead. The other issue, I suppose, is around acute versus historical, or recent versus historical. A lot of the reviews that have been set up or have been done, and the models that they've recommended, seem to have, first of all, they're very health-oriented, and seem to have in mind, although it's unsaid, that the type of victim survivor they're thinking about is perhaps someone who's experienced a one-off sexual assault, not necessarily by an intimate partner, and that, in a sense, it's a kind of simple case for them. I know that's not a sort of nice way to put it, but relative to some of the other cases that come through, or the other presentations, this represents a fairly simple issue of purely addressing the trauma of sexual assault. So some of the questions in the sort of broader literature has been, how do you balance this crisis response against the longer term care needs of women in the community? And having it, what Liz Ollie has talked about as a continuum of care in an AXA paper that she wrote in 2005. So how do you link up or have a continuity of that crisis response through to, 5 years down the track or 2 years down the track, particularly where women are going through a criminal justice process that does take 2 to 3 years. The second is a question about whether, in fact, those systems actually, or that sort of reviews of hubs, etc., actually has the right victim survivor in mind. I was in WA in November, and they had some really interesting stats. Sexual Assault Referral Centre there, which is a crisis response unit, had set up the database to record all the information that came through with crisis presentations over a sort of an 18-month period, and they're continually adding to it. It's the forensic specialists that fill in the database because they understand all the technical forensic information, medical information that they have to impute into the computer, or enter into the computer. But they also collect other things like housing status, whether the person had experienced victimisation in the past, drug and alcohol, a whole range of things. And their question was, you know what, we think that we are seeing a slightly different type of client to what we were originally set up to see. Is this correct? And what they found when they did some of the breakdown was out of all their crisis presentations over an 18-month period, about 70% of them fell into what they were calling a complex case, i.e. previous victimisation, mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues, etc. The idea of the simple one-off represented actually a minority for them. The question, I guess, for me is, what does other service data tell us? And if it's telling us something similar, then how does that feed into how we're actually setting up some of our crisis responses? That, in fact, might represent a bit of a area of collaboration between the two sectors, because it's there where you're starting to get similar service needs in terms of housing, in terms of, sort of the longer-term community-based support. Unfortunately, we simply don't have the service data to be able to say, and so people are sometimes making policy in a bit of a vacuum. Sorry, sometimes they make policy in a bit of an evidence vacuum. I mean, they're aware of that, but it's also about prioritising getting that information. Where am I? Okay, so just to come back to those tensions, how much time do I have? Oh yeah. What time was I supposed to finish? 1:45. I've got 5 minutes. Are influenced by these things, organisational structures and cultures, where there's different philosophies about what you're doing, where there are different aims and objectives. Models of trauma, types of sexual assault and models of support. However, having said that, as much as it's important to have shared understandings about the aims of crisis intervention and how victim-centred approaches work within it, I think it's also essential to resolve, I think it's also kind of important to keep in mind or to be concerned about a systems response that actually tries to conflate the different outcomes between different service systems. That makes sense. That is to say, although there may be shared belief that victim-centred crisis responses exist at a conceptual, ideational or policy level, it doesn't mean that will readily translate into the day-to-day practice of each of those different roles. And indeed, it may be the case that in order to realise the objective of being victim-centred, delineated, clear and non-overlapping objectives might be key. And certainly some of the service or the evaluations within the SARCs was because people were working together, they actually got clearer understandings about what their roles were for the victim survivor in the timeline of crisis response through to, for instance, reporting or going through the criminal justice process. So a number of police officers said, I could actually, because one of the things that they had within St Mary's was a crisis worker who was there. The first thing that victim survivor saw was a crisis worker. She wasn't a counsellor. This wasn't about providing therapeutic support. This was about providing practical support in that first instance. She introduced that woman or victim through to everybody else. This is such and such, this is what their role is, etc. She was then, she would explain the process to the victim survivor about where she was going to next, and then she sat in with the victim survivor while she was giving the statement. And police said that was invaluable because I could do my job, which is the evidence gathering. I didn't have to think about necessarily, it wasn't basically saying I can now be insensitive, but they knew that they could ask some tough questions and that there was some support for them too about what the victim survivor required. So I guess the flip side of the interagency collaboration is that clarity around roles because you are working together. I probably have like another 20 minutes, so I'm not actually going to do that to you, even if I do have control over the watch. That seems unfair. We can talk about some of the challenges, I suppose, during the question time if people would like to, except for it looks like that, which is to say our geography. And I guess just to kind of end, as I said, I'm keen to hear about how individuals and groups working together and across different service boundaries have fleshed out ideas like victim-centred, and I guess the productivity of tensions. I don't think tensions are a bad thing. I think sometimes that gets lost because we're not documenting it, and what happens is we start to talk about collaborative responses, we start to talk about collaboration, we start to talk about integration, and they become buzzwords and they become an end in and of